Number 1. Albert Fish. The gray man Hamilton Howard Fish was born on May 19, 1870, in Washington, D.C., and from the very first years of his life, the world he entered was one defined by loss, instability, and cruelty. His father, Randall Fish, was a boat captain who operated along the Potomac River and was 75 years old at the time of Hamilton's birth, an extraordinary age gap that left the family without a patriarch almost immediately, as Randall died when young Hamilton was just 5 years old. His mother, Ellen Fish, was 43 years younger than her husband, and when Randall died she found herself utterly unable to care for her children on her own. The decision she made next would set the course of Hamilton Fish's life and, by extension, the lives of the children he would one day destroy. She placed him in St. John's Orphanage in Washington, D.C., a facility that was supposed to provide care and structure to children without families, but which instead became, for the young boy who would one day be known as Albert Fish, a chamber of horrors. At St. John's, Fish was subjected to regular and severe physical beatings. The staff at the orphanage routinely beat the children in their care, and Fish himself would later describe what he witnessed and experienced there in terms that leave no room for misunderstanding. He said that seeing so many boys whipped had ruined his mind. Those words, plain, blunt, and devastating, capture something essential about what happened to Hamilton Fish in those years. The beatings did not break him in the way one might hope. Instead, they twisted something deep inside him, awakening in the young child a disturbing association between pain and arousal that would define his psychology for the rest of his life. He began to enjoy the beatings. He sought them out. The more he was beaten, the more he craved it, and this perverse cycle of sadomasochism, ignited in an orphanage by people who were supposed to be his caretakers, became the foundation of everything that followed. Fish also began wetting his bed during this period, a detail that criminal psychologists have long noted as a significant warning sign in children who go on to become violent offenders, along with cruelty to animals and fire-setting, the so-called McDonald triad. He remained at St. John's until he was approximately 9 years old, when his mother had secured a government job and was finally able to bring him home. But by then, as those who have studied his case have noted, it was far too late. The damage had been done. By the time he was 12, Fish had formed a disturbing relationship with a local boy who introduced him to deviant behaviors, and Fish spent his weekends visiting public bathhouses where he spied on young boys. He began writing obscene letters in response to classified advertisements. He was, by any measure, a deeply disturbed young person, and not a single adult in his life recognized it, intervened, or sought help for him. He grew to adulthood, married an 18-year-old woman named Anna when he was 28, and fathered 6 children, maintaining an outward appearance of normalcy that concealed a private world of escalating deviance and violence. Over the following decades, Fish sexually abused children on a scale that is almost incomprehensible. He later claimed to have molested more than 400 children across 23 states, targeting children who were black, disabled, or otherwise marginalized, people he believed would not be taken seriously by the authorities. His most notorious crime occurred on May 25, 1928 in New York, when Fish visited the home of Edward and Delia Budd under the pretense of hiring their 18-year-old son for farm work. During the visit, he persuaded the family to allow their 10-year-old daughter, Grace Budd, to accompany him to a birthday party for his niece. The Budds agreed. They would never see their daughter alive again. Fish took Grace to an abandoned house he had already selected in Westchester County, New York, a location called Wisteria Cottage, and there he strangled her, dismembered her body, and over the course of approximately 9 days, consumed portions of her flesh. He later described what he had done in a letter to the Budd family, a letter so graphic that newspapers refused to print its full contents, and it was this letter, sent in November 1934, that finally brought him down. A postal inspector traced the stationery to a boarding house where Fish had once lived, and detectives located him at a rooming house in New York City and arrested him on December 13, 1934. During his subsequent trial in March 1935, psychiatrists described a man with at least 18 documented sexual perversions and a body riddled with needles he had inserted into his own groin over decades. He also confessed to the 1927 kidnapping and murder of 4-year-old Billy Gaffney in Brooklyn, and to the strangling of 8-year-old Frances McDonnell on Staten Island in 1924. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before finding him guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Grace Budd. He was sentenced to death and executed by electric chair at Sing Sing Prison on January 16, 1936. He was 65 years old. The case of Albert Fish stands as one of the most disturbing in American history, not merely because of the crimes he committed, but because of the clear and traceable line from his years of abuse at St. John's Orphanage to the monster he became. A line that no one drew and no one followed, until it was far too late for Grace Budd and the other children whose lives he destroyed. Number 2. Henry Lee Lucas. The Confession Killer. Henry Lee Lucas was born on August 23, 1936, in Blacksburg, Virginia, and if the early life of Albert Fish represents a failure of institutional care, then the early life of Henry Lee Lucas represents a failure of the family itself. A catastrophic, sustained, and almost unimaginably cruel failure that began before Lucas was old enough to understand what was being done to him. He was the youngest of 9 children born to Anderson Lucas and Viola Lucas, and the household he entered was, by any measure, one of the most abusive and degrading environments imaginable for a child. His father, Anderson, had lost both of his legs in a railroad accident and had been given the nickname No Legs by people in the community. Unable to work and consumed by his own misery and alcoholism, Anderson Lucas was a largely absent force in the household. A broken man who eventually died of hypothermia after crawling out of the house on a winter night to escape his wife's violence and cruelty, a detail that speaks volumes about the kind of woman Viola Lucas was and the kind of home her children were born into. Viola Lucas was, by every account from those who knew the family and from Lucas's own extensive testimony, a woman of extraordinary cruelty. She was a violent alcoholic who also worked as a prostitute, conducting her business in the family home while her children were present, and she regularly forced young Henry to watch. She beat her children with whatever was at hand. She beat Henry so severely on at least one occasion that she left him in a coma for days, and no one, not a neighbor, not a doctor, not a teacher, not a social worker, intervened to remove the children from her care or hold her accountable for what she was doing to them. Viola also forced Henry to dress in girls' clothing and to wear his hair long, humiliating him publicly in ways that his peers amplified through ridicule and mockery. When Henry was approximately 10 years old, he suffered an eye injury caused by his brother. His mother refused to seek medical treatment for the injury, and the neglect was so prolonged and complete that Henry Lee Lucas ultimately lost his left eye entirely as a result. He was fitted with a glass eye, and the disfigurement became another source of humiliation and social isolation throughout his childhood. Lucas dropped out of school and began drifting in his early teens. He was first arrested and sentenced to prison at the age of 18 on a burglary charge. By the time he was in his mid-20s, he had accumulated a criminal record that reflected a young man completely unmoored from any stabilizing force. On January 11, 1960, the relationship between Henry Lee Lucas and his mother Viola reached its catastrophic end in Tecumseh, Michigan. The two had been arguing when Viola struck Henry with a broomstick. Henry Lee Lucas, now 23 years old and carrying a lifetime of rage and trauma, stabbed his mother in the neck with a knife. Viola Lucas died of her wound. Lucas was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 20 to 40 years in prison. He was transferred to the Ionia State Mental Hospital after 2 suicide attempts and was paroled in 1970 after serving 10 years, despite serious concerns from prison officials about his fitness for release. In 1976, Lucas met Ottis Toole at a soup kitchen in Jacksonville, Florida, and the two formed a criminal partnership that resulted in a series of murders that neither man was ever fully held accountable for. Lucas was arrested in June 1983, and once in custody began confessing at an extraordinary pace, eventually claiming responsibility for approximately 600 murders across the United States. He was convicted of 11 murders and sentenced to death for one case involving an unidentified victim known only as Orange Socks. However, investigative reporting by the Dallas Times-Herald and subsequent investigations by the Texas Attorney General's office revealed that many of his confessions were demonstrably false. He had been in other states during some of the crimes he claimed to have committed, and investigators had coached him with details he then incorporated into his confessions. Governor George W. Bush commuted Lucas's death sentence to life imprisonment in 1998, the only death sentence Bush commuted during his tenure as governor. Henry Lee Lucas died of heart failure on March 12, 2001, at the Ellis Unit in Huntsville, Texas. He was 64 years old. The true number of people he murdered remains unknown to this day. Number 3. Charles Manson. No name Maddox. Charles Millis Maddox was born on November 12, 1934, in Cincinnati, Ohio, and his entry into the world announced, with almost cruel precision, what the world thought of him. His mother, Kathleen Maddox, was 16 years old, unmarried, and apparently so indifferent to or overwhelmed by her newborn son that she did not give him a name. His birth certificate listed him simply as No Name Maddox. His biological father was most likely a man who called himself Colonel Scott, a transient laborer who disappeared as soon as he learned Kathleen was pregnant and was never a presence in his son's life. Kathleen Maddox was herself a deeply troubled young woman. She drank heavily, engaged in petty crime, and was entirely unequipped to raise a child. The defining event of Manson's earliest childhood came when he was approximately 5 years old. His mother was arrested for armed robbery and sentenced to 5 years in a West Virginia state penitentiary. Charles Manson, not yet old enough to go to school, was left without a parent. He was sent to live with his aunt and uncle in McMecken, West Virginia, who were deeply religious and strict in ways that did little to provide the warmth and stability the young boy desperately needed. When Kathleen Maddox was released from prison, she reclaimed her son but provided no more stability than she had before. The two drifted between rooming houses, motel rooms, and the homes of relatives in a pattern of instability that became the only consistent feature of Charles Manson's early life. By the time he was old enough to be in school, he was already exhibiting the manipulative and aggressive behaviors that people who knew him in childhood would later describe with the benefit of hindsight. His mother eventually placed him in the Guybaldt School for Boys in Terre Haute, Indiana, a school for troubled youth where Manson later claimed he was mistreated by staff. He escaped 3 times. After his third escape, he was sent to the Indiana School for Boys in Plainfield, Indiana, a more secure facility where, Manson alleged, staff members beat the boys and older residents sexually assaulted younger ones. By the time Manson was in his early teens, he had already spent more of his life in institutions than out of them, had never experienced a stable family home, had been abandoned by both parents, and had been subjected to abuse from multiple directions. He ran away repeatedly, survived by theft and petty crime, and was arrested and reincarcerated in a cycle that repeated itself throughout his adolescence. By the time Charles Manson was released from the Federal Correctional Institution at Terminal Island in California in March 1967, having spent the majority of his 32 years of life behind bars, he traveled to San Francisco, where the counterculture movement of the late 1960s provided him with a ready-made environment of young, vulnerable, and spiritually searching people exactly suited to his particular skills of manipulation and control. He built what became known as the Manson family, a commune of followers whom he controlled through sexual manipulation, hallucinogenic drugs, isolation from their families, and a constructed apocalyptic worldview he called Helter Skelter. On the night of August 8, 1969, members of the Manson family entered the home of actress Sharon Tate at 10050 Cielo Drive in Los Angeles and murdered Tate, who was 8.5 months pregnant, along with her houseguests Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, Wojciech Frykowski, and 18-year-old Stephen Parent. The following night, Manson led his followers to the home of grocery store owner Leno LaBianca and his wife Rosemary LaBianca, where both were murdered. In total, 9 people were murdered across 2 nights under Manson's direction. On January 25, 1971, Charles Manson was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. That sentence was automatically commuted to life imprisonment in 1972 when the California Supreme Court ruled that all death sentences imposed prior to that year were unconstitutional. He was denied parole 12 times and died in prison of cardiac arrest on November 19, 2017, at the age of 83. Number 4. Ottis Toole. The Jacksonville Killer. Ottis Elwood Toole was born on March 5, 1947 in Jacksonville, Florida, and the household he was born into defies easy description. It was a world of such layered abuse, religious extremism, sexual violence, and occult influence that it reads less like a real family home and more like something from a nightmare. His mother was a Christian extremist who was deeply abusive toward her children, both physically and psychologically. She dressed young Ottis in girls' clothing and treated him in ways that reflected her own profound dysfunction rather than any coherent attempt at parenting. His father abandoned the family entirely, leaving her as the sole adult presence in a household already defined by chaos and cruelty. His older sister sexually molested him from a young age. These are not allegations or speculations. They are details that Toole himself described in recorded statements and documentary interviews that investigators and biographers have incorporated into verified accounts of his background. The most extraordinary and disturbing influence in Toole's early life was his maternal grandmother, a woman who described herself as a Satanist and who called young Ottis her devil's child. This grandmother exposed Toole to grave-robbing expeditions to collect body parts for what she described as satanic rituals, engaged him in ceremonies involving self-mutilation, and generally cultivated in the child a relationship with death and desecration that was deliberate and sustained. Toole also suffered from epilepsy, which caused frequent grand mal seizures throughout his childhood, and had an IQ of approximately 75, indicating mild intellectual disability, conditions that were not treated, not accommodated, and not recognized as requiring any additional support or care. He displayed pyromania from a very early age, setting fires that he later admitted sexually aroused him. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade with no stable home, no stable relationships, and no intervention of any kind from social services or mental health professionals. In 1976, at a soup kitchen in Jacksonville, Florida, Ottis Toole met Henry Lee Lucas, and the two formed a criminal partnership that became one of the most dangerous in American true crime history. He was convicted in 1983 of 6 murders and received multiple death sentences that were later commuted to life imprisonment. The case that brought Toole the most lasting infamy was the 1981 abduction and murder of 6-year-old Adam Walsh, who was taken from a Sears department store in Hollywood, Florida, on July 27, 1981. 2 weeks later, Adam's severed head was found in a drainage canal in Indian River County. Toole confessed to the murder multiple times and then recanted. The Hollywood Police Department officially named him as Adam's killer in 2008, 27 years after the child's death. By that time, Toole had been dead for 12 years, having died of liver failure at Florida State Prison on September 15, 1996, at the age of 49. Adam's father, John Walsh, went on to create America's Most Wanted and became one of the most prominent advocates for missing and exploited children in American history, turning the tragedy of his son's murder into a decades-long mission that has helped recover thousands of missing children and bring countless fugitives to justice. Number 5. Richard Ramirez. The Night Stalker. Richard Ramirez was born on February 29, 1960, in El Paso, Texas, the youngest of 5 children born to Julian and Mercedes Ramirez, Mexican immigrants who had settled in a working-class neighborhood near the border. His father, Julian, was by multiple accounts a man prone to violent rages who physically abused his children when his anger overtook him. Richard suffered 2 significant head injuries in his earliest years and was diagnosed with epilepsy as a child, suffering from grand mal seizures that went largely unmanaged and untreated. These details, the abusive father, the epilepsy, the head injuries, are significant on their own. But the single most documented and transformative influence in Richard Ramirez's childhood was his relationship with his older cousin, Miguel Ramirez, a Vietnam War veteran who came home from the conflict carrying something far darker than the ordinary wounds of war. When Richard Ramirez was approximately 10 years old, still in elementary school, Miguel began showing him photographs that depicted women Miguel claimed to have raped, tortured, and killed during his service in Vietnam, including in some accounts a photograph of Miguel posing with the severed head of a Vietnamese woman. Richard Ramirez, at 10 years old, was exposed to these images repeatedly, and Miguel bragged openly about the violence he had committed in ways clearly designed to impress his younger cousin. At age 13, Richard witnessed an event that would mark him permanently. During an argument, Miguel shot and killed his own wife Jessie point-blank in front of Richard. Miguel was found not guilty by reason of insanity and was released 4 years later. For Richard, watching a woman be executed at close range by the man he admired was not an event that frightened him away from violence. It was an event that normalized it at the deepest possible level. In 1982, at age 22, Ramirez relocated from Texas to Los Angeles, arriving with no employment and a growing interior world of violent and satanic fantasy. He embraced Satanism openly and sincerely, viewing himself as an agent of the devil. Between mid-1984 and August 1985, Richard Ramirez terrorized California in a way that few killers before or since have matched in terms of sheer randomness and savagery. He entered homes through open windows and unlocked doors at all hours. He killed men and women, children and the elderly. He shot, stabbed, bludgeoned, and strangled. He left pentagram symbols at crime scenes. His victims were of multiple races and backgrounds. He had no victim type, no pattern investigators could predict. The city of Los Angeles was consumed by fear. Hardware stores sold out of window locks. The media named him the Night Stalker. He was ultimately identified and captured on August 24, 1985, when a 13-year-old boy spotted him trying to steal a car and neighbors who recognized him from newspaper photographs chased him down on foot and held him until police arrived. His trial, one of the longest and most expensive in California history, resulted in conviction on 13 counts of murder, 5 attempted murders, 11 sexual assaults and 14 burglaries. He was sentenced to death on 19 counts. Richard Ramirez died on June 7, 2013, at Marin General Hospital near San Quentin, of complications from B-cell lymphoma. He was 53 years old and had been on death row for nearly a quarter century. He never expressed remorse for anything he had done. Number 6. Aileen Wuornos. The Damsel of Death. Aileen Carol Pittman was born on February 29, 1956, in Rochester, Michigan, and from the very first day of her life, the circumstances of her birth announced a story defined by abandonment. Her father, Leo Dale Pittman, was a diagnosed schizophrenic who had been convicted of the rape of a 7-year-old girl. He was in prison when Aileen was born and never played any role in her life. He later committed suicide while incarcerated. Her mother, Diane Wuornos, had married Leo Pittman at age 14, and when Aileen was just 4 years old, Diane abandoned both her daughter and her son Keith entirely, walking away and never returning. The 4-year-old Aileen and her brother Keith were taken in by their maternal grandparents, Lori and Britta Wuornos, who legally adopted both children. Aileen would not learn until she was approximately 10 years old that these people were her grandparents rather than her parents, and the discovery that her real mother had simply walked away added another layer of betrayal to a psyche already being damaged by what was happening inside the home. Lori Wuornos was an alcoholic who, by Aileen's own consistent and repeated accounts across many years and many interviews, sexually abused her. The household was characterized by harsh discipline, emotional volatility, and the complete absence of warmth or security. At age 14, Aileen became pregnant, later stating she had been raped by a friend of her grandfather's. She carried the baby to term, gave birth in a home for unwed mothers and gave the child up for adoption. Shortly afterward, her grandmother Britta died, and Lori Wuornos threw Aileen out of the house. She was 15 years old, with a 9th grade education, no money, no family, and nowhere to go. She began living in the woods near her former home and soon began engaging in prostitution as the only means of survival available to her. She drifted across the country throughout her late teens and 20s, accumulating a criminal record that included armed robbery and assault, and she was working as a prostitute along Florida's highways into her 30s when her life reached its violent breaking point. In November 1989, Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old electronics store owner from Clearwater, Florida, was found shot dead near Interstate 75 in Volusia County. Aileen Wuornos later confessed to killing Mallory, claiming he had raped and sodomized her. Subsequent investigation revealed that Mallory had a prior conviction for attempted rape in another state. Over the following year, between 1989 and 1990, Wuornos killed 6 more men along Florida's highways. She was arrested in January 1991 after her identity was established through fingerprint matching and charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder. At her trial in 1992, she was convicted of the murder of Richard Mallory and sentenced to death, and was subsequently convicted of 5 additional murders for a total of 6 death sentences. In the final years of her life, Wuornos grew increasingly erratic and chose to waive her right to further appeals. She was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison on October 9, 2002. She was 46 years old. Number 7. John Wayne Gacy. The Killer Clown. John Wayne Gacy was born on March 17, 1942 in Chicago, Illinois, the only son among 3 children born to Marion and John Stanley Gacy. He was named after the Hollywood actor John Wayne, a figure of masculine American idealism, and from the very beginning of his life, there was a cruel irony in that name, because the man who gave it to him, John Stanley Gacy, would spend the entirety of his son's childhood making clear that his son did not and could never measure up to the image that name implied. John Stanley Gacy was an auto repair machinist and a heavy drinker, and when he drank he became abusive, physically violent toward his wife and toward his children, resorting to a leather razor strap to beat them in ways that went far beyond any reasonable understanding of discipline. The particular contempt he reserved for his son was of a different and more corrosive kind than mere physical violence. John Stanley viewed his son as a failure of masculinity, as soft, as inadequate, as a disappointment, and he said so repeatedly and cruelly, using the word sissy as a weapon against a boy who was overweight, unathletic, and born with a congenital heart condition that prevented him from participating in the physical activities his father valued. Gacy was also the victim of sexual abuse in childhood, later stating that he was sexually molested by a friend of his father's when he was 9 years old. He also suffered a significant head injury at age 11 when he was struck by a swing on a playground, causing a blood clot in his brain that resulted in blackouts continuing until he was in his mid-teens and the clot was dissolved with medication. Despite this deeply troubled foundation, Gacy managed to forge a surface life as an adult. He attended business college, married twice, had children, ran a construction company in suburban Chicago, became active in local politics, and performed at children's hospitals and community events as a clown character he called Pogo the Clown. Behind this facade of remarkable thoroughness, he was murdering young men and burying their bodies beneath the crawl space of his house in Norwood Park Township. Between 1972 and 1978, John Wayne Gacy murdered at least 33 young men and boys, ages 14 to 21, making him at the time of his conviction the deadliest serial killer in American history. His undoing came through the disappearance of 15-year-old Robert Piest in December 1978, who had told his mother he was going to speak with a contractor about a summer job and never came home. That contractor was John Wayne Gacy. When police searched his home, they found the first bodies in the crawl space, and the excavation that followed, conducted over weeks, shocked the nation. Gacy was charged with 33 counts of murder. His trial in 1980 featured extensive testimony about his crimes and his mental state. His defense argued insanity and the jury rejected the argument, deliberating for less than 2 hours before returning a guilty verdict on all counts. He was sentenced to death and executed by lethal injection on May 10, 1994, at the Stateville Correctional Center in Crest Hill, Illinois. He was 52 years old. Number 8. Edmund Kemper. The Co-ed Killer. Edmund Emil Kemper III was born on December 18, 1948, in Burbank, California, and stood 6 feet tall before he was a teenager, a physical size that, in the household of Clarnell and Edmund Kemper Jr., became yet another source of conflict and humiliation in a childhood already defined by them. His parents' marriage was volatile and corrosive, and when Clarnell and Edmund divorced in 1957, leaving Clarnell as the sole parent of their 3 children, the domestic environment for young Edmund did not improve, it became significantly worse. Clarnell Kemper was an alcoholic and she directed extraordinary cruelty toward her son, a cruelty that was both physical and psychological, shaped in part by her own fears and instabilities. She was acutely conscious of her son's enormous size and appears to have feared him even before there was any rational basis for that fear, responding to that fear by attempting to diminish him at every turn. mocking his height, belittling his intelligence and abilities, and treating him with a consistent contempt that he has described across decades of interviews as the central wound of his early life. Clarnell made the decision to lock young Edmund in the basement at night, confining him alone in the dark in a punishment that was, for a child, a form of psychological torture. When Edmund was 14 years old, he ran away from his mother's home and traveled by bus to Van Nuys, California, to find his father. His father had remarried and did not want him. Rejected, Edmund was sent to live with his paternal grandparents in North Fork, California. On August 27, 1964, Edmund Kemper, 15 years old, shot his grandmother in the head as she sat at the kitchen table. He then shot his grandfather when he returned home from grocery shopping, explaining later that he believed his grandfather would be angry with him for killing his grandmother. He was taken into custody, committed to a Atascadero State Hospital for the criminally insane, diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and spent 5 years there before being released in 1969 at age 21, directly against the recommendation of the prison psychiatrists, who noted his history of violence and his unresolved psychological relationship with his mother and recommended that he not be released into her custody. He was released into her custody anyway. Beginning in May 1972, Edmund Kemper began picking up female hitchhikers near the University of California Santa Cruz campus and killing them. Between May 1972 and April 1973, he murdered 6 young women: Marion Pesci and Anita Lucchesa, Aiko Koo, Cindy Shaw, Rosalind Thorpe, and Alice Liu. On April 20, 1973, he entered his mother's bedroom while she was sleeping and bludgeoned her to death with a hammer before decapitating her. He then called her friend Sally Hallett, invited her over, and strangled and decapitated her as well. Kemper then drove to Pueblo, Colorado, and called the Santa Cruz Police Department to confess. He was convicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to 8 consecutive life terms. He was sent to the California Medical Facility in Vacaville, where he has been held ever since, waiving his right to parole hearings multiple times. He has participated extensively in research interviews with FBI behavioral scientists, including agents Robert Ressler and John Douglas, whose work on criminal psychology drew heavily on their conversations with Kemper. He remains incarcerated at the California Medical Facility in Vacaville to this day. Number 9. Ted Bundy, the most charming monster. Theodore Robert Cowell was born on November 24, 1946, at the Elizabeth Lund Home for Unwed Mothers in Burlington, Vermont, to Eleanor Louise Cowell, a 22-year-old woman who had traveled from Philadelphia to give birth away from the community that would have judged her for it. The identity of Theodore's biological father was never definitively established, and his birth certificate listed no father's name. His maternal grandparents, Samuel and Eleanor Cowell, made the decision to raise the child as their own, and for years Theodore was told that his young mother Louise was his sister, and that his grandparents were his parents. He lived this foundational lie for years before eventually learning the truth of his illegitimacy, a discovery whose impact on his sense of identity appears, by multiple accounts and by his own statements, to have been profound and lasting. Samuel Cowell, the man Bundy grew up calling his father, was described by those who knew the family and in psychiatric reports prepared before Bundy's execution as an extremely violent and frightening individual who beat family members, kicked dogs, swung cats by their tails, and harbored intense racial and ethnic prejudices he expressed openly and without restraint. When Theodore was 3 years old, Louise took him with her to Tacoma, Washington, and she eventually married a man named Johnny Bundy in 1951, whose surname Theodore took as his own, becoming Ted Bundy. By multiple accounts from neighbors and schoolmates, Bundy was different in ways that were difficult to articulate, shy and withdrawn in some respects, yet capable of a manipulation and intimidation unusual for his age. He was bullied. By adolescence he was drinking alcohol, sneaking out at night to peer through neighbors' windows, abusing animals, and had accumulated a juvenile criminal record for burglary and auto theft that was later expunged. Between 1974 and 1978, Ted Bundy raped and murdered at least 30 young women across multiple states including Washington, Oregon, Utah, Colorado, and Florida. He was handsome, personable, and capable of projecting a helplessness and trustworthiness that he exploited with devastating precision, feigning injury, wearing fake casts, and asking young women for help before incapacitating them. He was arrested twice and escaped twice, continuing to kill after each escape. He was finally apprehended in February 1978 in Pensacola, Florida, following the murders of two Chi Omega sorority sisters at Florida State University, the attempted murder of two others, and the kidnapping and murder of 12-year-old Kimberly Leach. His televised trial in Miami in 1979 made him a grotesque celebrity. He was convicted of the Chi Omega murders and sentenced to death, and at a subsequent trial for the murder of Kimberly Leach, he was again convicted and again sentenced to death. He spent nearly 10 years on death row, giving extensive interviews in which he confessed to 30 murders and suggested the actual number was significantly higher. On January 24, 1989, Theodore Robert Bundy was executed by electric chair at Florida State Prison in Rayford, Florida. He was 42 years old. Crowds gathered outside the prison to celebrate. Number 10, Jeffrey Dahmer. The Milwaukee Cannibal. Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin to Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, and the early years of his life, by the accounts of those who knew the family, did not fit the profile of the devastatingly abusive childhoods that marked many of the others in this list. His father was a chemist, professionally accomplished and frequently preoccupied with his doctoral work in ways that left him emotionally absent from the home and from his son. His mother, Joyce, suffered from depression and anxiety and was dependent on prescription medications in ways that affected her stability and availability as a parent. In 1968, when Dahmer was 8 years old, his father reported to authorities that a sexual assault had been committed against Jeffrey by a neighbor boy. This incident was not followed up with any form of therapy or psychological support for the child. It was reported and then set aside. In that same year, Dahmer underwent surgery for a double hernia, and those who have studied his case note that after this surgery his demeanor changed. He became more withdrawn, more internally focused, and more disconnected from the world around him. From an early age, Dahmer developed a genuine and sustained preoccupation with dead animals. He collected roadkill, preserved insects and animal remains and chemicals, liked to impale animal heads on stakes, bleached chicken bones, and dissected roadkill to examine how organisms were put together on the inside. These behaviors were noticed by some adults around him but never acted upon in any meaningful way. His parents' marriage collapsed entirely in 1978, when Dahmer was 17 years old, and the divorce proceedings produced a detail that would stay with Dahmer for the rest of his life. Both Lionel and Joyce fought over custody of his younger brother David, then 12 years old. Neither parent sought custody of Jeffrey, who at 17 was legally an adult for custody purposes. Both parents, caught in the turmoil of their separation, left him behind. His mother moved away with David, his father moved in with a woman he would later marry, and Jeffrey Dahmer was left alone in the family home in Bath Township, Ohio, at age 17, with almost no money, no food, and no support of any kind. It was during this period of isolation, in June 1978, just weeks after his high school graduation, that Jeffrey Dahmer committed his first murder. He picked up a 19-year-old hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks who was on his way to a rock concert, brought him home, drank with him, and when Stephen tried to leave, struck him with a barbell and strangled him. He later said he had not wanted Stephen to leave. He had not wanted to be alone. Between 1987 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer murdered 16 more men, young men, most of them gay and many of them black, Hispanic, or Asian, from communities that were less likely to be taken seriously by law enforcement. He would meet victims at bars and bus stops, bring them back to his apartment, drug them with sedatives dissolved in their drinks, and kill them. He engaged in necrophilia and dismemberment, preserved skulls, and kept body parts in his refrigerator. His crimes were exposed on July 22, 1991, when Tracy Edwards, handcuffed but alive, fled Dahmer's apartment and flagged down a police car. When Milwaukee officers accompanied Edwards back to apartment 213 at 924 North 25th Street, what they found exceeded anything in their training or experience. Dahmer was arrested at the scene and confessed to 17 murders. His trial in 1992 turned on the question of his sanity. The jury found him sane and guilty on 15 counts of first-degree murder, and he was sentenced to 15 consecutive life terms. On November 28, 1994, Jeffrey Dahmer was fatally beaten by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, while on a prison work detail at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin. He was 34 years old.